Before you listen, if you enjoy the stories and want to hear more, then please consider subscribing. Most of you listening aren't subscribed, so please take this time to subscribe. Turn on notifications so you'll never miss a story and be the first to hear. You'll also be supporting me. Thank you. When my mom first suggested an exotic family trip to Tunisia, I was thrilled at the prospect of visiting a new country and culture entirely foreign to me. But our Tunisian vacation ended up taking an unexpectedly sinister turn early on, starting with all of us having the exact same ominous dream by our hotel. Things only grew stranger from there, ultimately culminating in the horrifying revelation that an actual grave resided right outside my room's window. What was meant to be a fun family getaway became increasingly supernatural in alarming ways none of us could have imagined. My mom, younger brother Jason, Aunt Mimi, and I were so excited to spend a week together exploring Tunis, the capital city. On our very first night at the hotel after the long transatlantic journey, I collapsed into bed, utterly exhausted, expecting to sleep like a rock. But I awoke with a panic start after only an hour or two, shivering and disoriented from an intensely vivid and frightening nightmare. In it, I had gotten up to use the restroom adjoining to my second-floor hotel room. But upon entering, I suddenly detected an undeniably sinister, dark presence lurking there, watching me, though I could not actually see anything. Terrified, I had tried frantically to get out and escape back to bed, but the bathroom door then violently slammed shut on its own and locked me inside. Just as the evil entity approached, I jolted awake in a cold sweat, heart pounding out of my chest. The next morning at breakfast, I hesitantly told my family about the strange, vividly scary dream, feeling rather silly doing so. But to my immense surprise, my mom and younger brother Jason independently shared that they too had experienced what sounded like the exact same intensely frightening nightmare. Even more disturbingly, my Aunt Mimi said that while she hadn't had any bad dreams, she did wake up in the middle of the night feeling an overwhelming chill and sense of unease permeating the room for no apparent reason. We all nervously laughed it off as simple jet lag and travel stress playing tricks on our minds. But a lingering sense of unease still hung over us as we set out to explore the city. That second night at the hotel, I made a conscious effort to think only happy, calming thoughts before drifting off in order to ward off any further sinister dreams. And after sleeping soundly until morning, I initially felt immense relief, thinking perhaps we had all just imagined things or shared some freak, coincidental night terror the first evening abroad. I figured that would surely be the end of anything peculiar occurring during our trip. Turns out I thought very wrong. Because the next morning at breakfast, my Aunt Mimi seemed uncharacteristically nervous and on edge. She then explained in a hushed tone that she had awoken around 3:00 a.m. needing to use the restroom. But upon entering, she saw what appeared to be a shadowy, human-like figure standing silently across the dark room, just staring directly at her. The entity did not move or speak. Mimi said she froze in sheer terror for a few moments before working up the courage to turn on the light. But then as suddenly as it appeared, the apparition vanished. I could tell from her shaken demeanor that she was telling the truth of what she experienced. Mimi was not the type prone to imagining things or embellishing stories for attention or drama. So any skepticism or rational explanations I had clung to instantly vanished upon hearing her account. Something deeply sinister clearly seemed to be going on within our hotel. My mom tried lightening the heavy mood that had descended over us by cheerily suggesting we spend the day immersed in sightseeing and leisure activities. But despite our best efforts to distract ourselves throughout the afternoon, an underlying cloak of unease and tension still permeated the atmosphere. That night, none of us dared sleep alone, and Aunt Mimi and I quickly decided to share a room, taking as much comfort as we could in strength in numbers and solidarity. As I laid wide awake in the dark, too unsettled for sleep, the beautifully ornate dome structure on the elaborate building across the street caught my eye outside our second-story window. I took some solace in silently gazing at its tranquil, almost angelic-looking golden aesthetic bathed in the glow of decorative lights. Focusing on its beauty gradually soothed me into finally drifting off just before dawn, seemingly the only one getting any rest that night. The next morning at breakfast, we'd all sat around solemnly picking at our food, overwhelmed by feelings of apprehension after another seemingly uneventful night. Despite the lack of further paranormal activity, the intense weight of everything we had experienced in that hotel over the past few days still hung densely in the air over us. We mutually agreed without hesitation to stick by each other's sides for the remainder of our dwindling time here. Later that evening, my mom approached the front desk attendant in the lobby while the rest of us silently waited to check out. I watched her engage him in nervous whispers before turning pale and stepping back, looking equal parts stunned and horrified as he gestured repeatedly with visible urgency towards the large window overlooking the sprawling cemetery behind the hotel. I knew then we were about to learn the dark, foreboding truth we all could feel deep down was coming. Back in the safety of our rental car, finally being far from that place, my mom reluctantly revealed what the clerk had anxiously disclosed: that the majestic palatial structure I had found such fascination and comfort in gazing at just outside our window was actually a highly decorated tomb adorning the cemetery directly bordering the hotel property. I felt the blood instantly drain from my face and neck as the implication set in that I had been unknowingly admiring and drifting off to sleep every night mere yards away from the buried dead, with only glass in between. While we never fully discerned exactly what malevolent entity or energy was haunting that hotel those nights, the series of unexplained otherworldly occurrences had most certainly tainted the entire trip, leaving us emotionally drained and on edge until our feet touched back down on home soil. Suffice to say, extensive location research and investigation on my part will be commencing well in advance before we embark on any future international family vacations. Once bitten, twice shy, I say. I was so excited to finally take my dream trip to Amsterdam. But what should have been a fun vacation took an ominous turn when I noticed a stranger from my flight showing up everywhere I went in the city. My unease turned to outright terror when I awoke one night to see him trying to break into my hotel room. Thankfully, he was arrested, but the whole ordeal taught me to be more cautious when traveling alone. From the moment I boarded my transatlantic flight, I was filled with anticipation for my long-awaited Dutch adventure. Settling contentedly into my window seat, I didn't pay much attention to the other passengers, but shortly after takeoff, I noticed the man in the aisle seat across from me staring in my direction. Trying not to be paranoid, I assumed he was just spacing out. I tried tuning out his gaze by reading, but could still feel his eyes boring into me. Once we were able to move about the cabin, he started walking up and down the aisle repeatedly, always slowing as he passed my row. My nerves were on edge, but I reasoned he probably just had restless legs or something. Landing finally in Amsterdam after the lengthy flight, I felt relieved to be free of that prickly sensation of being watched. After breezing through customs, I jumped on the train to my hotel in the city center. Ready to start enjoying this adventure, I pushed the odd flight experience out of mind. After checking into my hotel and unpacking, I set out to explore Amsterdam by foot. The pretty canals and eclectic architecture were even better than I'd imagined. But while having dinner at a cozy cafe that first evening, I sensed eyes on me. Glancing around discreetly, I froze. There was that same man from the plane, staring right at me from a few tables away. My appetite vanished instantly. I threw cash on the table and hurried back to my hotel, glancing over my shoulder the whole way. Had he intentionally followed me from the airport, or was it just an eerie coincidence? Either way, I could hardly sleep that night. The next morning, I wavered about sticking to my sightseeing plans. I didn't want this creepy stranger ruining my trip, but I also refused to hide away. I set out cautiously to explore the city's landmarks and museums, figuring I was likely safe surrounded by crowds. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling I was being watched. While gazing at the Van Gogh Museum's famous sunflowers painting, I suddenly noticed the familiar, unsettling face in a nearby group. My heart hammered, realizing he was definitely shadowing me. I moved quickly through the rest of the exhibit and jumped into a taxi back to the hotel. Over the next couple days, I reluctantly avoided busy areas and cut my trip short, constantly anxious I was being stalked. I even switched hotels, hoping my pursuer would lose track of me. But right after checking into the new hotel, I saw him milling around the lobby. How did he find me so fast? I hid in my room the rest of the day, jumping at every noise. That night I propped a chair under the doorknob and double-checked the windows. Exhausted, I eventually fell into a fitful sleep. Sometime after midnight, I awoke to strange clicking and rattling sounds. Peering through the peephole, I almost cried out. It was him, right outside my door, fiddling with a handle. Frantically, I pushed furniture against the entrance, shoved a dresser in front of the window, and cowered in the corner sobbing, wondering if I could make it to the balcony. Suddenly, I heard angry voices in the hallway as hotel security confronted the stalker. Police arrived shortly after and arrested him. A witness had noticed him scoping my room earlier. I ended up having to fly home early, badly shaken after narrowly avoiding whatever sinister intentions this stranger had. But I'm trying not to let the trauma prevent future travel. I know most people abroad are perfectly friendly. When I booked a room at the historic Hotel St. Paul for my study abroad semester in Paris, I envisioned soaking up the ambiance of the Masquerade district for my quaint accommodations. But what began as a charming experience soon took an eerie turn, as increasingly bizarre unexplained happenings began to plague my stay. The Age Hotel was picturesque by day, yet somehow sinister unknown forces seemed to creep out after dark. Arriving in Paris for the first time, I was instantly enchanted by the Hotel St. Paul's old-world architecture and charm. My cozy but admittedly petite room had a window overlooking the bustling cobbled street below, dotted with crowded cafes and quirky shops bearing the patina of centuries of time-worn history. By night, the neighborhood took on a much more haunted atmospheric mood, with the soaring Gothic spires that defined the Paris skyline cloaked in looming shadows. The first 2 evenings of my stay passed without incident. Jet-lagged from the transatlantic journey, I slept like the dead each night. But on my 3rd evening at the hotel, I was startled awake in the midnight hour by a nerve-splitting crash. Disoriented in the pitch dark, I fumbled to turn on the bedside lamp, and scanned the room with blurry eyes until I saw the intricately carved antique reading lamp now inexplicably lying smashed on the hardwood floor. Confused about what could have caused it to topple, as I certainly hadn't placed it close to the bed's edge before retiring for the night, I blearily cleaned up the jagged shards of ceramic and glass before uneasily settling back into a restless sleep permeated by strange dreams. The next morning, I hesitantly mentioned the odd occurrence to the friendly clerk at reception while checking my mailbox over coffee and croissants in the lobby. She furrowed her brow gravely at my account, and leaning in to speak in hushed tones, cryptically warned me to promptly let the hotel staff know if anything else strange or unnatural happened again during my upcoming stay. I chuckled anxiously and chalked it up to just a freak accident, assuring her I was likely just groggy and had knocked over the lamp without realizing. Later that day, as I strolled along the twisting, narrow cobblestone streets near the famous Notre Dame Cathedral, I felt an unexpected chill prickle the back of my neck, despite the mild, sunny spring weather. Stopping in a crowded cafe full of chattering people for an afternoon espresso, I hid my shaking hands in my lap under the table, overcome by an inexplicable wave of dread. I tried to brush it off as simply jet lag and too much caffeine, but couldn't quite shake the creeping sense of foreboding that had lodged itself in my mind. That night, as I reluctantly returned to my assigned room at the hotel, my skin prickled with goosebumps as I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The expectant silence felt unusually heavy, as if the space itself was somehow holding its breath. I attempted to read before bed, but found myself reading the same paragraphs over and over. Sleep came fitfully that night, as I frequently startled awake after only dozing briefly, although I could never recall what had woken me. Once I came to gasping for breath, finding my sheets and bedclothes tightly twisted about my body in narrow coils, although they had been smooth and neatly tucked when I had settled down to sleep just hours before. By the next morning, I was thoroughly on edge and sleep-deprived. While grabbing a quick breakfast in the lobby before class, I hesitantly approached the front desk clerk to ask if it might be possible to switch to a different guest room for the remainder of my stay. My laughably simple stated reason of persistent bad dreams sounded unconvincing even to my own ears. The clerk politely apologized that the hotel was fully booked currently, but after a pause, she hesitantly offered to provide the phone number of a local priest I could call to discuss my peculiar situation, with if it might ease my nerves. I forced a polite laugh to mask my unease and declined the offer, feeling utterly ridiculous at her dramatic suggestion. Surely there had to be some reasonable, mundane explanation behind the odd events I had experienced, I told myself. In an effort to stabilize my fraying nerves, I spent the entire next day immersed in crowded tourist sites and bustling cafes surrounded by the cheerful living. Being out in the sunshine and fresh air among throngs of fellow visitors did seem to help calm me somewhat, and push away the eerie happenings plaguing my nights as mere overactive imagination or paranoia brought on by culture shock. That is, until I returned to the hotel in the evening, when I was greeted once more by that same indefinable yet increasingly familiar heavy stillness, which undeniably permeated the long, dimly lit halls and shadowy guest rooms only after night had fallen. I lay tensely awake in bed for hours that night, irrationally straining my ears to detect any unusual sounds or unexplained movements stirring in the darkness. Sometime around midnight, I leaped up to check the bathroom door after seeing unexpected light spill out from the crack underneath it. I hadn't flipped any switches or turned any lamps on inside, so where was that warm glow coming from? Heart skittering nervously, I slowly crept over and hesitantly nudged the door open wider just as the light immediately clicked off, leaving the small room now as pitch black and apparently empty as I had originally left it. Feeling like a fool for allowing myself to be so easily spooked by strange shadows playing tricks on my eyes in my exhausted state, I still gained no more rest that night. By the following morning, I felt utterly drained, both physically and mentally. My rational, logical side remained convinced there must be reasonable explanations behind each odd occurrence in my room. But another more primal, intuitive part of me could not deny an underlying yet growing suspicion that something sinister and beyond my comprehension was subtly, gradually making itself at home there. I decided to push away those irrational thoughts once more, however, as I went about my studies, determined to enjoy the once-in-a-lifetime cultural journey I had embarked upon. My sense of calm and skepticism returned throughout the daylight hours exploring the city's many splendors. But the wall of denial I had built up came crashing down once more as I reluctantly returned to the hotel of that final evening of my stay. Greeted again by that expectant heavy silence, I took every precaution I could think of to ward off further disturbance during my last night there. I piled all my luggage against the room door after bolting it tightly shut, despite the staff frowning upon guests doing so in case of emergencies. I also left every lamp and overhead light burning brightly throughout the room all evening, determined not to lay shrouded in shadow a moment longer than necessary. Around 2:00 a.m., I was startled violently from an exhausted sleep by the decorative candlesticks lining the room's fireplace, mantel suddenly bursting into flames of their own volition. After recovering from initial paralyzing shock, I fumbled urgently to smother the fire before the ancient wooden mantel went up in flames too. By the time I succeeded in dousing the last smoldering wick, they had already burnt down dangerously low, leaving no rational explanation for how the stubs could have ignited on their own in the first place. I did not dare try sleeping again after that, instead of remaining dressed in my clothes, sitting tensely upright in an armchair facing the barricaded door, as the interminable night crawled by at an almost torturous pace. I flinched constantly at every unexplained creak or groan of the old building settling, staying alert to any potential movement I might detect stirring in the shadowy corners. As soon as dim pre-dawn light began creeping around the heavy velvet curtains, I finally felt safe enough to breathe fully again. I sat waiting anxiously for a reasonable hour to go downstairs and check out, eager to leave that place far behind me. The overwhelming sense of relief I felt at leaving that foreboding hotel vastly overrode any exhaustion I surely should have been experiencing after essentially not sleeping for 2 nights straight. As I handed in my key at the front desk, the kindly clerk gave me a knowing, sympathetic look that seemed to imply she was all too aware of the dark events that plagued unsuspecting visitors to this establishment. As I turned to leave, she leaned across the counter to gently advise I consider sleeping with the lights on at home and maintaining a protective talisman or item of faith under my pillow for at least a few nights following my difficult ordeal. Although I forced a gracious smile at her spiritual recommendations, I had no intentions whatsoever of so quickly dismissing her guidance again after what I had faced within those walls. In the end, while I may never fully understand what happened to me those nights, it certainly rattled my long-held skepticism about forces existing beyond the limits of our humble human comprehension. Thanks for listening in. If you like these stories and want to hear more, then please subscribe and like and support this new channel. We have more stories for you to listen to.